And if we put heat into that, they get faster and faster and faster and faster, and eventually the heat will break those hydrogen bonds. But even though these hydrogen bonds are weak, in water, they're strong enough that it requires a significant amount of heat to actually break them. So heat energy is trapped inside of that little space, that gap. So hot water has two things that they sound pretty similar, but one is high specific heat, which means that it can absorb and release heat. It can hold on to it. And it takes a lot of energy to cool down or heat up. It takes a lot of energy to heat up water, and it releases a lot of energy when it cools down. We measure this. The amount of energy it takes to raise 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius, is called a calorie. And we actually use that to measure energy. So we put calories on the outside of our food. We can measure that. And if you take chemistry, I don't know if it's intro to chem or gen chem, you burn a chip or a peanut or something, and you actually measure the energy given off. Or they used to. I'm assuming we still do. You can take these machines called bomb calorimeters. It's a sort of metal cylinder or sphere. Put food in it, combust it, and measure the calories given off. And so a calorie is just the energy required to raise 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius. Because water can absorb and release heat, it has a high heat capacity. Think capacity. This room has a seating capacity, the amount it can contain. Sometimes I get going and I just stumble over my words. The amount it can contain. It's exciting, right? I think it is anyway. It's like the amount of this it can contain. The heat energy, we can absorb and release heat without a huge change in temperature, which is very important for our homeostasis, because throughout the day, we don't just plummet in temperature. But then when we get too hot, we can sweat, we can drink water, we can break those hydrogen bonds and give off, but I'll get there. Let me talk about this one next. The reason, well, one of the 100,000 reasons that we are not quite like Venus or Mars is we still have our large oceans. Our oceans can absorb heat energy. That's good in 2 ways. One, when the sun's beating down on that side of our planet, it's absorbing a lot of that heat energy, so we're not all trying to retain it. 2, when you're on the opposite side and the sun isn't beating down on you, when it's night, you don't freeze to death because those oceans give off that heat energy. So that's why if you've ever been to the coast, or if you live in coastal areas, especially California or North Carolina, the homes used to not be built with air conditionings. For the most part, I think that most of them are nowadays, but the older ones weren't, because you wouldn't need it necessarily for most of the year. You had kind of a nice buffered temperature because the ocean would absorb a lot of energy, but it would also give off energy, and you had that nice coastal temperature. But our bodies do the same thing. I get too excited about oceans, but I have to remind myself there. We'll expand on this further for you, so don't get caught on it, because I will. Dealing with that sweating and giving off energy, we have a high heat of evaporation, or some textbooks call it a high heat of vaporization. It means the same thing. I think the biology textbooks are saying vaporization, so I should probably change my slide eventually, but it just means that water turns to a gas when those bonds are broken, when it heats up enough, and that energy is released. It'll pop. We release that heat energy we had. Those hydrogen bonds have to be broken to do so, but it allows us to give off heat energy. So animals like us that can't overheat, and sweating is a mechanism to try to defeat overheating, we can release energy that we're storing. So we can give off some energy when we sweat. You ever been in a pool before on a warm day and you feel nice and you get out and you're freezing even though you know it's hot outside? It's because you're covered in water, you're sweating, you're releasing those bonds, all that water is evaporating, taking that heat energy with it. So high specific heat, high heat capacity, high heat of vaporization or evaporation. And water is a great solvent. We call it the universal solvent. That's a new science word. It just means it dissolves something. When you dissolve something, you end up with a solution with solutes in them. There's a lot of big words there, but solvent just means it dissolves things. We use water to clean things, right? It breaks bonds, it cleans things up. And so and that's all just due to the positive and negative side of that molecule, able to repel or attract other molecules and break them apart, or repel them or pull them. And so it breaks things apart. So when you put ions or ionic bonds in water, they're dissolved. Because the positive and negative, so let's use sodium chloride, for example, in NaCl. The sodium and chlorine, sodium received an electron, chlorine gave up, well, reverse that. Chlorine received an electron, sodium gave up an electron. And so they're stuck to each other in a solid. Put that in water, the static attraction between the hydrogen bonds, the polarity of water, is much stronger than the energy required to keep them together. So it just pulls them apart. If we were to do that, if we had a pan of water with salt in it, we know that the salt would dissolve. We let the pan evaporate over a day, we come back, that salt is there on the bottom of that pan. They bound back together once those hydrogen bonds weren't there anymore. And so it's a good medium for reactions. It allows things to bounce around. It allows us to move. At the cell level, inside of our cell, it's not all water, but most of it's water. And so it allows for transport. It allows for us to pull things apart, put things together. It's what keeps us alive. And so most of our cell is made up of water. I don't know why those 2 bullet points are so small. They're important. I'm not whispering. When ions are dispersed in water, they move and collide, allowing reactions to occur. Ions that are hydrophilic, or not just ions, substances that are hydrophilic, that means water-loving. Hydro is the Greek word for water. Philia is the word for love. So hydrophilic means water attracted. Hydrophobic, if you think phobia, fear, hydrophobic is water fearing. So you're repelled by water. When we start talking about the cell, we're going to use these terms again, hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Usually non-polar or non-ionized molecules or atoms are hydrophobic. And so we can do a lot inside of our cells. We can move things from being hydrophilic to hydrophobic or vice versa by attaching or removing some molecules. The outer shell of our cells is made up of little fats that are hydrophilic and hydrophobic, and it creates a barrier. So you'll need to be familiar with what these words mean. Remember, hydrophobic, water-fearing; hydrophilic, water-loving, either attracted or repelled. Because of the hydrogen bond attraction, because of the hydrophobia and hydrophilia, because of the energy it takes to break those hydrogen bonds, water has a surface tension. We've probably seen that before. Some things float on top of that water. There's not enough weight, not enough energy to break those bonds. Or if you're like oil and you're hydrophobic, you float, right? You don't mix with this. Some things can float on top of that. So we say water has a high surface tension. Those bonds are so stuck to each other, those hydrogen bonds are so stuck, it takes a lot of energy to break them. Us compared to water molecules, we can step in water, right, and break right through. We can break that surface. But some organisms can't. And so we have whole groups of organisms that actually live on the top of this surface. They either float or they retain at the top. So there are plants, there are insects, there are some animals that just hang out right there because of that. And so we wouldn't have that ecosystem, we wouldn't have that ability if water didn't have that high surface tension. So that has a lot of biological importance. Ever been to a pond or a lake or something, and you're at the edge? You can see algae on top, a little duckweed, little green plants. You see the insects floating on top. That is their habitat, their area of living. They don't live above, they don't live below, they live on top. Most will spend their whole lives there. Because of that polarity, water molecules stick to each other and stick to other things. So cohesion, stick to each other. So if they cohesion, cooperate, same molecule, stick to each other. Adhesion, stick to other polar things or other molecules. So cohesion, cohesive, they work together, they stick to each other. Adhesion, an adhesive, you can stick like a glue, something to something else. So cohesion to each other, adhesion to other polar molecules. And we've experienced that. If you've ever put a straw in a drink before and you can kind of see the drink go up the straw, even though the level of the water is, or liquid that you're drinking is right there, it goes up, it's sticking to the straw. It's because that cylinder, that area we have, the smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller we have, water tends to move up those tubes, sort of against gravity, and down. It can pool. You ever accidentally left a hose in your pool overnight and then drains it? You didn't realize it. It's siphoned out of that. Well, how does that happen? Well, the pressure difference, yes, but as well as the cohesion and adhesion. Both of those combined cause it to siphon out. A lot of organisms rely on that. Our system of movement to get nutrients and fluids through our, not just human bodies, but animals and plants and all kinds of eukaryotic organisms, we rely on this ability. It's a transport medium for our blood, used to move ions, gases, etc. Plants use this. Their root systems suck up water, but somehow it gets all the way up against gravity to the tip tops of the trees. This ability to move through small vessels, small tubes, like our veins or roots, is called capillary action. I'm going to bold it. Capillary action. And finally, one of the coolest aspects of hydrogen bonds, it makes sense when you think about it, but initially it's kind of like, oh, well, I didn't realize that. Frozen water is less dense than liquid water. We've seen that, right? Ice floats. Well, why? Ice tends to feel heavier than water, so what's going on? When water molecules get cold, when they lose energy, they slow down. Eventually becoming, you can go from gas, liquid to solid as you lose that energy. Well, think back to that picture of those hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. The oxygen negative side was attracted to the hydrogen positive side. You're still moving around as a liquid, even though you're kind of stuck to one side or the other. You're still being pulled to those other molecules. As you get colder and colder and colder and colder, you lose energy. And so you lose the ability to move away from that other molecule. And so eventually, those positive and negative sides of those molecules line up perfectly, making this lattice structure. And I'll come back to this page, but I want to go to this picture. Making this lattice structure. So in warm water, these molecules are bouncing around, but that positive side is still attracted to that negative side. Cold water, you get slower and slower and slower. But see how close together those molecules are? So cold water is heavy, densely packed. Eventually you get so slow that the negative side and positive side line up perfectly and you form this nice diamond lattice structure, allowing for a pocket of air. So see how densely packed cold water is, how close together those molecules are? So you have more molecules tightly packed together in cold water than you do in frozen water. So cold water is dense, heavy. Frozen water is lighter. It floats. The coldest water, or the heaviest water, is 4 degrees Celsius. When does water freeze? 0 degrees Celsius. So cold, dense 4 degrees Celsius water is heavier than 3 degrees Celsius, heavier than 2, heavier than 1 degree, heavier than 0, which is frozen ice water. And so because of that, instead of using my hands, I'll just draw. If we have a body of water in the cold winds of winter, that snow, are blowing across, because of the vaporization, because of the cold air stealing that heat energy, the top of your pond, your lake, or your body of water gets colder first before the bottom, switching between seasons. So imagine going between fall to winter here, or summer to fall. So this is going to become, 9, 8, 7 degrees Celsius, 6, 5, 4 degrees Celsius. 4 degrees Celsius is the heaviest form of water. So 4 degrees Celsius sinks. So eventually, after sinking and sinking and sinking, all of this water becomes 4 degrees Celsius. But as it gets colder and colder and colder outside, this drops in temperature as well. So it goes from 4 to 3. But that's not going to sink because 4 degrees is heavier. To 2, to 1, to 0. Well, that's ice. That's frozen water. So eventually, you see ice freeze, or water freeze into ice on the top before you do on the bottom of a system of water. You've seen that before. You can at least picture this, right? So we know that it takes a long time for this ice to get thicker and thicker and thicker. So the first initial frost, you can't just go out walking on a pond, it's probably just a very brittle ice flow there. This helps as a refuge, or acts as a refuge for organisms that live in this system. And so even when those cold winter winds are blowing and this gets colder and colder and colder, it's going to take a while before this becomes 3, 2, 1, 0. So it acts as a refuge for your aquatic organisms or your organisms that brumate over winter. So your fish, some reptiles, insects, and things. And it allows them to continue living and not die every year. Well, that's pretty biologically important. So that liquid exists at the bottom until it would require either a shallow pond or a very, very, very cold winter for that pond or lake to freeze all the way through. Because this soil is also absorbing energy and giving off heat as well. And so it's going to take a lot for that to freeze all the way through. And so here's that picture, if you kind of forget, to remind you that denser water, 4 degrees Celsius, sinks first. And so you have that turnover.